So first, Bridget Fielder is an associate professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She researches and writes on the long 19th century and African-American literature, particularly attending to race, gender, species, and childhood. She's the author of Relative Races, Genealogies of Interracial Kinship in the 19th century in 19th century America, published out of Duke University Press in 2020. And you can also check out Professor Fielder's writing and cultural criticism on Avidly. Nikki Hessel is a professor of English at the Victoria University of Wellington, where she studies the 18th century and British Romantic literature, as well as the intersections of print culture and Indigenous writings. She's the author of Romantic Literature and The Colonized World, Lessons from Indigenous Translations from Palgrave in 2018. Part of her next project, Sensitive Negotiations, Indigenous Diplomacy and British Romantic Poetry, was also published in the journal 18th Century Fiction this fall. And Sal Nicolazzo is an assistant professor at the University of California at San Diego. She specializes in 18th century literature with an emphasis on law, empire, and capitalism. She's the author of Vagrant Figures, Law, Literature, and the Origins of the Police from Yale University Press in 2021, so a very pandemic book. She also has an article in 18th century fiction from December on whiteness in the 18th century that feels relevant to the conversation. And I will go ahead and now drop in the chat links to these additional writings that are referenced, as well as the Google Drive folder to the introductory chapters of all the professors' books, if anyone has any interest in returning to them. But I guess without further ado, I'd love to hand it over to Bridget to start.
Thank you so much. I want to say thanks so much to the organizers for this event. I realize that this is some amount of additional work to do, especially during pandemic times. And I want to thank especially grad students for Zooming in today, and to give a quick shout out to any first generation college students who, like myself, who might be here in the audience. I'm very glad that you're here. One very quick correction to my bio. I'm actually not a professor in the English department here at UW. I was a professor in comparative literature. That department was closed permanently in the spring. And I'm now in an odd position of being a professor of the College of Letters and Sciences here at UW, rather than having a departmental affiliation at the moment. And so I'll start today. I understand people have read some of the introduction to Relative Races, and I'm going to skip ahead a bit to the end of the book and read a tiny, tiny snippet of my book's final chapter on racial reconstruction, interracial kinship, and the interracial nation. This chapter ties together some of the project's threads for theorizing racialization via both time and space. And I'm beginning here in order to frame some of the directions that this project has taken me, at times, admittedly, without my initially realizing those interconnections and trajectories, toward the new book that I'm currently working on drafting, and a newer, more recently begun project that's still in its early stages of conception, some initial parts of which are appearing in other publication venues, that I realize this book has been really kind of foundational for allowing me to be able to do this other kind of work. My final chapter turns to narratives of mixed race people that illustrate the queer circularity of racial reconstruction. Rather than simply rehashing 19th century discourses of racial mixture, I seek to draw out the spatio-temporal connections these discourses make between body, family, and nation. These scalar dimensions of race prompt us to figure race's queer genealogy as recursive, not necessarily linear. Tracing race from body to family to nation, both as myths of racialization have done and as I have, perhaps ironically, organized the trajectory of this book, ultimately brings us full circle. If the white body produces the white family, which thereby reproduces the white nation, then that nation is supposed, in turn, to reproduce white bodies. Both the reasoning and the trajectory of this equation is circular. If the body is white, then the family is white. If the family is white, then the nation is white. And correspondingly, the nation is white because it is comprised of white families, which are white because they are comprised of white bodies. And this pattern would repeat into infinity. The confusion in this genealogy lies in this circular logic. Viewed in light of the simultaneous formation of race in individual bodies and in the larger racialization of populations, this racial genealogy reveals not simply the direction of race's trajectories, but their never-ending cycle. Racial construction is a never complete process, but is part of a cycle of racial reconstruction. As we examine the processes of race making with which this project is concerned, we can see that race is never simply made or even named, but is always in a perpetual state of making and remaking, articulation and rearticulation. I refer to this circular logic of race's collapsed scales and recursive teleology as racial reconstruction, the continual formation and reformation of race that has implication from the bodily to the national scale, and which is never completed, but necessarily continues ad infinitum. In this understanding of racialization, we might therefore recognize its social construction as impermanent, since the bodies are not simply racialized, but find themselves implicated in the constant state of race making. The argument that racialized bodies ultimately produce or are produced by racialized nations proves little about racial reproduction, revealing only the constant flux of racialization, not simply its construction, but its necessary continued reconstruction. And so this logical fallacy becomes, I think, most evident in these 19th century discourses of racial mixture. White supremacist conceptions of the nation understand nation building as inherently linked to white reproduction, and therefore the interracial family becomes a threat to the state. The imagined threat of non-white people to the state manifests itself often not in terms of power, but in terms of place, that is, where race resides. Interracial bodies do not maintain imagined racial purity, and integrated spaces do not maintain racial segregation. These facts simultaneously reveal race's location at these multiple scales and its temporality, as race doesn't simply move through physical and temporal genealogies, but around and within them. While the primary texts in several of my chapters of this project grapple with anti-Blackness and their understandings of racial mixture, I'm interested in this last part of the project less in their potential for Blackness's erasure, potential which I acknowledge nonetheless, than I am in their proliferation of racial reproduction, in ways in which Blackness is neither hyperdescended nor entirely whitewashed. And the scalar temporal shift to which I turn at the end of the project shows again how queer racialization is not individualistic, but spatially and temporally expansionist, collapsing the body, family, nation paradigm and revealing the circularity of this logical relation as race is formed and reformed. And so now I want to talk a little bit about the new directions that this project is leading me and kind of how I get there from, I think, where I left off in this book's final chapters. The book that I'm currently working on completing is called Animal Humanism, Race, Species, and the Child in the Long 19th Century, from which I've published a few pieces excerpted from earlier chapters. And this project is concluding with 2 chapters that are centered on the writings of Paul Deloney de Shayu and John James Audubon, respectively, both of which are framed by the mixed race taxonomies of whitening that worked to humanize their non-human subjects and framed their own human-animal relations. Both of these men were instrumental in the taxonomy of species in the United States, and both were of at least somewhat ambiguous racial origins. De Shayu was a French-American explorer and travel writer who is credited with having confirmed both the existence of the gorilla and the pygmy ethnic group of Africa for white Western scientists. Sources vary as to when exactly and where he was born. Some places include New York, Paris, Louisiana, the most likely of which is what is now the island of Réunion, just east of Madagascar. His father was white, a French trader, and even during his life, he was rumored to have had a mother of African descent. De Shayu's writing appears against the backdrop of rumors of his own mixed race ancestry, a point that's essential to his own project of animal taxonomization. he's also working in Africa with Black guides throughout this taxonomization project, a point that is absolutely essential to the work that he's doing. American naturalist John James Audubon was born in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, a really interesting little known fact about him. His father, an enslaver, owned sugar plantations. The famous ornithologist was the son of a woman named Jean Rabin, who died a few months after his birth and who may or may not have been white. Audubon Père also fathered 3 children with a woman named Catherine Sanit Bouffard, an apparently free mixed-race woman working in his household. Bouffard also bore at least 3 girls to Audubon Père. Neither of these women was the woman who Jean-Jacques Audubon Père was married to, a French white woman. But the histories of these mixed-race sisters of Jean-Jacques Fille are interesting, I think, for the ways that he distances himself from both the place of Saint-Domingue and his disdain for mixed-race Black women as well. And I began working on this project while I was writing the dissertation on which Relative Races was based. Now that I have a little bit of distance from this book, I can see how my discussion at the end of this one in particular takes up similar questions of racialization via genealogies and geographies, with which I ended the end of my first book. Each of these men must in some way distance themselves from the possibility of Black family and negotiate their relation to Black colonial spaces and other Black people first, in order to then taxonomize themselves as white, before they can become the kind of person whose animal taxonomizations are taken seriously by white Western scientists. A newer project, which for now I'm simply calling Early Black Futures, takes up theories of and technologies of Afrofuturism in order to explore early African-American attention to Black childhood and futurity. In this project, I'm revising Afrofuturism's usual scope by taking up technologies that facilitate Black future imagined via what I'm calling old tech, technologies like print, integrated public transportation, dolls. And I've published a piece on dolls and a short story by Alice Dunbar Nelson, and have a piece forthcoming that takes up late 18th century African-American writing that directly addresses children and the formation of Black community, with which I'm calling a generational scope for forming Black community. When we consider print technologies, especially among the larger scope of Black technoculture and theological discourse alongside other notions of the speculative, we can understand early Black community literature and generational address as a form of a kind of proto-Afrofuturism. The fullest understanding of Black literary sociality, I'm arguing, is generational in scale, extending Black print from producing Black community to imagining Black futurity. The scope for understanding Black community and Black futurity necessarily must recognize the centrality of Black children to Black literary communities, a centrality that depends upon the fact of Black reproduction. And thinking Black children among authors' potential readers and future generations which include my own and the many Black children after us all, that would be the would-be beneficiaries of this work. So this project has me again returning to the end of Relative Races as I think about the possibilities for racial reproduction that aren't foreclosed by white supremacy, but which deliberately project Blackness into a radically hopeful teleological future.
Thank you so much. Nikki, are you ready to go?
Tēnā tātou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. So lovely to see you all here. Thank you very much to our hosts for inviting us to talk today and to be on such a special panel. This is a really exciting chance to talk. So I'm just going to talk briefly about my 2018 book, which I have here. Romantic Literature in the Colonised World, Lessons from Indigenous Translations. Assuming not everyone's totally familiar with it, it's a book that looks at Indigenous language translations of Romantic texts, mostly poetry, but also Walter Scott's Ivanhoe in Timor Nui-a-Kiwa, the Pacific Ocean, but also in Kerala in southern India. And in the book, I partnered with Indigenous translators to examine these texts and think about what the translators were doing with them, what kind of changes in particular they made to the original English literary texts. I was particularly interested in those moments of divergence and how those texts were operating within Indigenous literary and knowledge systems. A big part of what I want to talk about today, though, is methodological, I think, rather than the sort of content of this book, and why I wanted to write it and what I think about it looking back a couple of years later and having moved on to other projects like Bridget's just talked about. I really wanted to make some contribution towards dismantling the idea of firstness. I think in the American context, you use the word Columbusing to describe this phenomenon, and I'm writing something at the moment that word, of course, very useful, doesn't apply to us in the Pacific, and so I'm writing something in the moment talking about endeavouring, based on Cook's ship, as perhaps being the word we need to use in my part of the world. I think it's the settler condition that we are always belated. We're late to these lands, we're late to the knowledges about these lands, we're late to the relationships on these lands. And the least we could do in the face of that belatedness would be to be humble about the knowledge systems and epistemologies that are already here. Of course, we don't do that. Many of our metaphors in scholarly discourse are settler colonial metaphors. We break new ground and we push back frontiers, and we find new things and we're the first person to do something and so on. And we take all those metaphors from extractive settler colonial processes. It's really unfortunate that those are the metaphors we use to describe ourselves, and they're also just simply untrue. They're racist, but they're also untrue. We're never the first. As I say, belatedness is our condition. I've just come from the UMD seminar, the anti-racist seminar that Tita Chico was organising with Christina Huang and Bakari Diaby talking about citational practice. And Bakari has done this amazing work on Black women critics in the 20th century, romanticists whose theoretical and critical contributions have been completely forgotten. I like to think that the work I was doing was similar to that in the sense that it was trying to show that there is an intellectual genealogy of engagement with Romanticism amongst Indigenous writers and translators going back decades and sometimes centuries. So I want my field, Romantic Studies, to be alert to who our critical tipuna are, who our critical ancestors are. There were already fully formed knowledge systems and epistemologies in these countries that were perfectly capable of dealing with Romantic literature when it arrived. And we don't want to duplicate the colonial process of sailing up somewhere and saying, there doesn't seem to be a knowledge system here, there doesn't seem to be an intellectual world here. We need to make sure that we are aware of our ignorances and illiteracies in the face of those knowledge systems. I think that's why I felt it was important to start what is in fact, like as Bridget's outlining, a kind of multi-pronged, multi-project set of ideas here with Indigenous languages. So much of taxonomy and epistemology is in a language, not outside it. And again, if we're not literate in those languages, if we're ignorant of them, that doesn't mean we shouldn't constantly keep in mind that there's this vast intellectual world that we're not privy to and that we don't understand. I did a lot of the work on this book when my children were quite young, and it was in the context of living in a bilingual household and being in a lot of situations where everyone was speaking Te Reo Māori, everyone was speaking in Māori, or people were switching between Māori and English, and really becoming aware of how much intellectual work was being done in the Māori language that wasn't making it over to the English parts of the conversation, either because it didn't need to, because everyone had enough fluency to understand you didn't need to say it again in English, or because it wasn't appropriate to say it in English. It made sense to say it in Māori, it wasn't appropriate to share that knowledge in English. And some of that is symbolised for me. The reason I've got the book itself here is that some of this is symbolised for me in the cover image there. I'll drop this in the chat, the link to Matthew's work, but this is a piece by Matthew Mcintyre Wilson, who's a Māori jeweler and weaver and artist. He's absolutely amazing. And I'm just going to tilt my camera a bit because I'm actually wearing the brooch that is photographed there. So the reason that Matthew's image there is partly it's just an absolutely perfect image for what my book is about, which is the kind of headspace that Romanticism occupies in Indigenous thought. But also Matthew and I are friends. Our children have come through Kohanga Reo and Kura together. That is Māori immersion kindergarten and Māori immersion schooling together. And so I already had the relationship in place with him to ask him if I could use that image. And for him to give me the brooch afterwards, after we had collaborated on the image. I know we're going to talk about relationality more, but I think that's a really important part of what I want to say. I tried to pay Matthew because he's a professional artist and I wanted to pay for the image and he wouldn't accept any money, but he said I could pay him in writing. So when one of his next exhibitions, I wrote an essay to accompany that as payment for the collaboration, and I can drop the link to that essay as well. So I'm going to close then, because I'd really like to hear more of the discussion, I think, by thinking about the question I often get asked is, I often get contacted and asked about methodological questions and people who want to do work like this. And I guess my question in response to that is often, you want the work, but does the work want you? I think that we have things round the wrong way a lot of the time methodologically with what we want to do in literary studies in this space, which is we think of a project and then we go away and do the reading, we build the relationships that will make that project possible. And I think the thing we ought to be doing, again, to reverse our sense of firstness, is start by working on ourselves, start by building the relationships that might make this kind of knowledge creation possible. And then maybe you will think at the end of that process that the work itself, the project itself, is one that you should be doing or that needs to exist in the world. To start in those relationships rather than to start in what is the thing that I'm trying to produce. I don't always live up to those standards myself. I'm as much a product of our academic system as anyone else. But in this project, and Corey mentioned very kindly the new project, Sensitive Negotiations as well, trying to think in those terms about the relationships that underpin our research and how we get to a project that can meaningfully manifest those relationships. I think that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I can already tell I have a lot of questions, which is exciting. And now finally, Sal Nicolazzo.
Well, thank you once again to all of the organizers for doing all the work to make this possible and to put us in conversation. I know I've missed conversation this year, and yeah, I'm just really looking forward to the conversation that unfolds. So yeah, I guess I'll just talk a little bit about the book and what I was trying to do with it, and I'm gonna have a little less about where I'm going next, because it's pretty recent and I don't know where I'm going next, but I figure that not knowing can be a good place to start from. So the book is most centrally about what seems like a deceptively small category, vagrancy. It's both a legal and an imaginative category, and what sort of the overarching argument of the book is that in the 18th century British Empire, vagrancy was really central to forging the imaginative scope and legitimacy of policing before the emergence of what we think of as the modern metropolitan police force. And so this is both the legal practice and the sort of crucially imaginative practice that makes the presumed legitimacy of the police even thinkable before the police exist, and at least the British and later US legal context. And so more generally, right, the way this works is I ended up sort of, I hit upon the project basically by just noticing that this term was, and this specific law, like vagrancy laws, were showing up in a lot of seemingly disparate places. And part of why this works so powerfully to kind of forge the imaginary of policing is that vagrancy was an incredibly diffuse and catch-all category. It was expansive. It was essentially sort of additive. So a lot of early vagrancy statutes really start to proliferate in the early modern period. So a lot of it is part of the Elizabethan construction of poor law and parish relief, and sort of all the way up until the new Poor Law of 1834, these vagrancy statutes just continually add on more and more behaviors, statuses, and acts that make this a kind of generalized category of suspicion or of anticipated future cost or threat. And it's that anticipatory stance towards future cost and future threat that, like, that's what forms the kind of blueprint for what would later be deemed kind of the legitimate scope of the police once the police exist. And so one of the things that I've been, as I've been sort of listening to both Bridget and Nikki's presentations, one of the things I just wanted to kind of draw some connections. One of the things I really love about Bridget's work is her attentiveness to the sort of the work of open-endedness and flexibility in racialization. And in many ways, like, that's how vagrancy laws worked. They were never racially specific or exclusive as a category, but they were deployed in all sorts of racializing ways, especially in different geographical locations across the British Empire. And so a sort of really obvious example of this would be how it was already sort of central to labor regulation in early modern England, and of course was already racialized because vagrancy laws are really linked to early modern, like, anti-Egyptian legislation. But what happens in the colonies in the Americas is that vagrancy law becomes sort of the foundational blueprint for laws governing slavery, and vagrancy law becomes a major mechanism for the apprehension of people suspected to be fugitives from slavery. And so that's part of this whole history of the criminalization of Black mobility that, of course, Saidiya Hartman talks about sort of so importantly in the 19th century. Like, this goes back to sort of the 17th century deployment of vagrancy laws as this crucial legal architecture. And so more broadly, I think, one of the ways that I tried to kind of trace this across a number of both legal and literary texts was that, as this really catch-all category that could include potentially anyone, and yet, of course, not anyone, or rather, right, vagrancy is so vaguely defined that you could imagine technically anybody being arrested for vagrancy because the laws are so broad. But of course, that's not how it worked. It was clearly, it was meant to criminalize both, not only homelessness, which is, I think, what we often think of, but also such a broad array of categories naming suspicion, including gender nonconformity, including poor women's reproduction, including the generalized suspicion of who might be seen as future criminal, and so it's I became really sort of anytime I saw vagrancy come up in a legal or a literary text, I became really sort of attuned to how this open-endedness worked both to expand a huge legal net that could potentially entrap anyone, and at the same time to really sort of define and harden hierarchies of status. And it's that sort of constant interplay between the sort of the policing of boundaries on the one hand and the kind of improvisational open-endedness of discretion that it encourages that I think is what made these laws sort of so powerful. And so I can go into more of the details of that if people have questions about the legal specificities, but I wanted to pivot towards sort of why this is a book about literature at all, when in many ways this is like very much legal history. And the biggest one is that, you know, I got, you know, I saw this is a form of legal practice that is foundationally based on anticipation. It's proleptic. It's based on imagination of a potential sort of future. And I think the thing that became really clear to me when I was sort of tracking this in both legal and literary texts was that there's a kind of improvisational open-endedness that literary scholars, I think, often, you know, we want to think that this is in service of liberation, of boundary crossing, of fluidity, you know, in ways that are sort of against authority. But of course, in the case of vagrancy law, the kind of improvisational open-endedness, the work that it's asking, say, magistrates and justices of the peace and much later on police officers to do is like, that's exactly what makes these laws so powerful. That's exactly what makes them sort of at the origins of the kind of incredibly broad discretion that, say, you know, for instance, police officers in the United States legally have to deploy violence. It's that kind of that's in many ways really central to the origin of that sort of wide discretion. But of course, at the same time, right, that the way vagrancy ended up being deployed in literary texts or in texts that didn't necessarily have immediate legal force, I think it opens up a kind of archive of the history of the police that predates the police as an institution. And so that's what I sort of hope to trace here. And in many ways, I think it's you know, what I wanted to try to emphasize was that literary critical analysis actually does have something foundational to offer, not just to the history of policing, but to the contemporary, like, imperatives of police abolition today. And so, for instance, right, when police reformers in late 18th century London, who are really central to kind of pushing forward the idea of a centralized urban police force, when they were advocating this kind of police force, they used ways of imagining spaces and urban landscapes that really echoed things like loco-descriptive poetry, or really echoed sort of literary modes in order to kind of imagine the city as a space to be policed. Domestic fiction is about articulating relations to, you know, gender, subsistence, and social reproduction, which is really central to the gendered enforcement of vagrancy laws throughout the 18th century, because it's about sort of anticipating which children might in the future draw upon parish poor relief funds. And so, right, I think the entire history of domestic fiction is actually really central here in ways that we haven't acknowledged. And of course, you know, today, policing continues to be debated through metaphors and figures. So one of the things that I end the book on is a close reading of George Kelling's and James Wilson's 1982 article, Broken Windows, right, which offered the foundational metaphor for broken windows policing and was really instrumental in the development of what would come to be known as quality of life policing in New York under Rudy Giuliani, for instance, in the 1990s. So the power of that metaphor is to me really central to how policing sort of to real sort of histories of policy and ways in which we can intervene. And there's so much more I could get into, but I'll just briefly close with like two main points. And one is that, you know, what became clear in tracking vagrancy law is that in the 18th century British Empire, this link between security, policing, and resource distribution is absolutely sort of on the surface. It's obvious. This is centrally about resource distribution just as it is about securitization. And I think today that connection, it's absolutely still there, but it can be, it's a little harder to make. When we talk about policing, the debate now is often still really centrally about safety, by which we mean, prevention of threats of interpersonal violence or harm. But of course, if we think about harm and violence more broadly, as many abolitionists activists and scholars have done for decades. I'm thinking of Ruthie Gilmore, for instance, or Nicole Siegel. Resource distribution is at the center of police. If you're thinking about policing, you are thinking about resource distribution, and that's the main sort of vector of harm and violence that we can shift our attention to. And of course, the other thing I've been thinking about a lot this year is, what happens if we think about our work as being in responsibility to the ways that we and our fields and our institutions are complicit in these histories. And so, for instance, I'm really following scholars like Gina Zorowski, Megan Pizer, Carrie Sinanen, and others who have been making crucial interventions about the whiteness and coloniality of 18th century studies. But I'm also thinking more sort of concretely about how are our classrooms implicated in policing and surveillance? Are universities employing police forces, right? University of California has its own police force. That's as do many institutions, especially in the US. And I've been really thinking about, and this could be maybe something we talk about, is there anything that 18th and 19th century studies, since that's the focus of this conversation, is there anything that these fields and that these fields can offer to a broader work to orient our scholarly and pedagogical practices toward abolition? And at the same time, how do our fields need to change in order for us to do that? I've mostly been thinking in many ways about teaching and what Dorothy Kim calls cop pedagogy, right? Are there ways that we are encouraged to teach like cops, or that we are encouraged in our teaching to involve the surveillance and policing of students? And if so, how can we change that? And I'm also thinking about, what does it mean to try to remake our fields more generally? How can we be, as Nikki just put it, more humble about, the ways that work legibly in our fields actually needs to depend on other fields that aren't necessarily legible to, in my case, 18th century studies. I think one of the things that became really clear in writing this book was that I could not proceed in an analysis of this legal category in the 18th century without real conversation with and extensive citation of scholars who have done super important work, often on 18th century material, but who aren't legible as scholars in 18th century studies, because that's not where their tenure line is located, or that's not how their book was received. And I'm thinking of Simone Brown's Dark Matters, which is totally central to and so important for any theorization of race and surveillance in the 18th century, and that should be read more widely in 18th century studies. Also thinking of a lot of work in trans studies that is mostly not about the 18th century, but is totally crucial for thinking about surveillance and gender and the origins of things like identity documentation. So I'll stop there. I can go into more detail in other in the Q&A. I mostly just want to hear the conversation and be in conversation with all of you. Thanks for bearing with me. I'm just very tired. It's the end of the quarter, and so my apologies if I was not entirely clear. But just looking forward to more of the conversation.
No apologies at all. That was amazing. Thank you all so much. I feel like we all kind of touched on a lot of points that I'm hoping we can talk about a little bit. But I guess one spot that I figure we could open up conversation a little bit is about relationality in general. And I guess this is coming up for me both in Nikki's comment about displacing firstness and the idea of whether the work actually wants you. And I think also I mean, clearly relevant to like the content of your books as well. But I guess I'm curious your thoughts and to hear you all talk a little bit more about how relationality informs your work and your like pedagogy as like a scholar and a teacher, and also how you think it overlaps maybe in some ways with your hopes for what 18th and 19th century studies can produce or is already producing.
I can say something very quickly just to get things started. So yeah, I think that I've touched on this already in my talk, and you're right, Corey, in the classroom as well, these things are very important. One way I think about it is that when you introduce yourself in a Māori setting, you give what's called a pepeha, like a kind of history of yourself, and that subsequent speakers, part of their job is to find some sort of connection between you and them, right? And there are all sorts of ways this happens, but the idea is to find some point where your lives or your histories or your ancestors touch. And that, I think, as a way of thinking of yourself operating as a scholar, operating as a teacher, but also in relation to your scholarly work, that what you're looking for is the moment at which people across time periods, across continents, very different experiences, and perhaps across some really unpleasant and violent histories, are able to link their lives together and able to touch in a way that can make the thing that happens next meaningful. And that meaningfulness isn't necessarily pleasant. Like, that may be meaningfulness of reparations, it may be meaningfulness of the acknowledgement of harm, some of the things Sal's just been touching on. But that's one way in which I think about relationality in my own work.
I was really struck by the way Nikki just talked about literal relationships in this, and I'm thinking about this in some ways as a kind of methodology. What is our methodology for having actual relationships with other human people, and thinking that for one mode of what we might call interdisciplinarity, but which also has to, I think, extend beyond thinking purely within the bounds of the academy as well. But thinking about how I see, my own field and intersecting with other fields, one of the questions that I often have is, what are the relationships that scholars are put into? What conversations are citational practices putting scholars into? And it's striking to me to see in some iterations of interdisciplinary work, especially around race and racism, how the field in which I kind of most clearly see myself, 19th century US studies, but within African American studies, 19th century African American literary studies is a kind of, or early African American studies more broadly, just before 1900, is a broad, rich field, is often absented from those conversations, save the naming of a few fairly prominent scholars, some scholars who I adore and cite and engage and who I've been thinking about for many years since I was a graduate student. But to see only a handful of especially Black 19th century African Americanists, it's a large interracial field. There are many white African Americanists who do very, very good work. But to just kind of see who is imagined as part of that conversation and who isn't, has been, I think, pretty revelatory for my understanding of, how I see other fields, especially fields who are maybe late coming to Black studies, engaging with Black studies scholarship. How do they do this without 4 decades of Black studies scholarship? How do they do this while thinking that theory only happens and theorization of Blackness is only happening within the academy? How do we do this thinking, Black feminism is a 20th century concept and not like a thing that's operating in other names with Black women's understandings of, how race and gender and inflect upon them in the world, since the 18th century. And thinking about what that means for the work that I want to do as I, try to learn about whatever it is I'm trying to write. And so one thing that's been really important to me, especially I think in this past pandemic year, is trying to make connections with and talk to and learn more about Black, Indigenous, and other scholars of color in the adjacent fields that I'm interested in, and seeing a lot of parallel conversations running in many fields that are adjacent or not adjacent, and wanting more conversations of relationality across those fields in those ways, because I think that both in terms of the actual work and in terms of how any of us are situating this for the kind of larger methodological questions of not just how do I write this thing, but how do I run my classroom? How do we structure our institutions? We need to think deliberately about what our relations are, and what are the relations between all of this parallel work that's happening in a variety of fields around this topics of race and racism and decolonization, especially because these are now pretty clearly things that all fields need to think about in and outside of the humanities in some way, if they are going to be real operators in the 21st century.
I guess I'll just add briefly, because those are both such, I don't know, I'm really going to keep thinking about all these reflections for a long time. I think I've been thinking a lot about, what, well, if any 18th centuryists or attendees of ASEX may know, there have been a lot of really necessary, really hard, and still sort of very unfinished conversations in 18th century studies about structural racism of the field more generally. And I continue to think about how to, I think, Gina Zarowski put it in his amazing essay, This Ship We're In, that I just keep returning to and teaching in multiple contexts, where she says, how do we think about our work, not in terms of opportunity, but responsibility, right? What does it mean to be a specialist in this period that is so implicated in sort of ongoing racism and colonialism, not just in the archive that we define ourselves as specializing in, but also in the way the field itself has historically been structured. How do we see that as a place of responsibility? And what are the limits of what the field as constituted can do? And I've been, I think, the only way to, I've been thinking about it a lot in terms of just the material structures that make these kinds of relationships or encounters possible or not possible. In particular, the way scarcity is often what underpins sort of seemingly just purely ideological debates about this in a department level, which is debates like, do we hire next in British literature, or do we hire in US multi-ethnic literatures? And these things are sort of pitched as inherently different fields and as different priorities, and the British literature as a hiring field is presumed not to be related to fields like Black studies, right? I mean, that is often how these departmental debates play out. And so I've been thinking a lot about what does it mean to not necessarily be invested in the survival of my field of 18th century studies as it is currently configured? What does it mean to maybe not have that as my top priority in these departmental meetings or something like that? And so that's sort of one ongoing conversation. I've been really, really inspired by Ranjani Chatterjee, Alicia Christoph, and Amy Wong's essay Undisciplining Victorian Studies, which I think is just so 18th century studies needs kind of that intervention in many ways. And, but then, yeah, I've also been thinking a lot about relationality in the classroom. Like, the more I think about, the history of policing and its sort of ongoing history, right, as a kind of like real afterlife of, not even afterlife, like just a life of these 18th century colonial formations that I've been researching. I think there's so much I think that we need to end up unthinking and unlearning about ourselves as teachers when we start thinking, okay, what does it mean to actually really dedicate to like not policing or surveilling our students? And I take this up carefully because I actually really insist that like policing is not the same as just all forms of discipline. There's a really specific legal and material history that is not actually just a continuum of all forms of disciplining. I'm, Foucauldian in a lot of ways, but like that's where I depart from him. But at the same time, I mean, the continuum of disciplining that happens in our classrooms really can lead to literal cops being called on our students. There are so many instances of this, and so I think all of the kinds of discomfort that I've been feeling as I've been experimenting with forms of things like ungrading, sort of really like not grading sort of to the extent that I can institutionally, the ways I've been experimenting with things like not worrying about whether a student has a legitimate excuse to, turn something in late or not show up. I think thinking about the ways that, what does it mean to see my relationship with my students as one where I don't actually expect to control them or fully know their internal experience or know if they really care about the class or not. Like that's been bringing up a lot of, I think, really productive discomfort. And what happens if we think about ourselves as like having to work through sort of tricky situations without necessarily just calling in some sort of higher institutional authority to deal with it for us. What does that reveal about the resources that we wish we had, but we don't have, for students in crisis, for instance, where we don't want to call an office that might call the police on them, but they need something we can't give. I think that I've been really thinking about that a lot this year in particular, because I think we've all had a lot of students in crisis. I don't have any answers for this. This is an ongoing question, but I think the kinds of relationships that we can build by sort of organizing around this and saying, okay, what would it take to have a university that doesn't have a police force? What would it take to have a world without policing? I mean, those are other kinds of relationships that can build these conversations.
I think there are a few directions that we can go from this, but I guess I'm curious, thinking about what you're saying, Sal, about I think kind of like redefining our role within academia and what that means, and redefining our role within whatever fields will exist eventually. And I guess also picking up on a few strains of definition or redefinition or reconstruction, both of race and colonialism. And I guess I'm thinking specifically also of something you said, Sal, in your book about vagrancy, the linguistic capaciousness of vagrancy. And I think this idea of like racial, the malleability of like the reproduction or reception of race, also in Bridget's book as well. And I guess maybe also finally sort of the idea of translation in Nikki's book as well, and that connection to definition or redefinition in your work. And I guess I'm curious, having gone through these book projects, how you feel your relationship has changed with those definitions that you ended up working with, and I guess also just with the idea of needing a strict definition of whatever concepts you're working with to begin with.
I mean, to pick up on this question of reconstruction and definition, I mean, rethinking and revising and reconsidering the language that I'm using in my book, and then outright recognizing that, like, the language that is available for me to use to talk about this right now is imperfect, and so this project is fraught with that imperfect language. Is something of a kind of huge process, I think, in writing. And my language over writing the project from, writing a dissertation to writing a book changed. My feelings about what I had cited changed. Things like, shifting my capitalization of the word Black, for example, or my discussion to not repeat racist epithets in direct or quotation, and to write a footnote saying, yeah, I cite this racist stuff, and I got tired of reading these words, and so I didn't write them in the main text anymore, as a thing I could do, to the invention and reinvention of terms that that comes by way of theorizing and whatnot, in order to explain things that are actually pretty complicated. I think is the work that we have to be able to do, not only in our writing, but also, in terms of these relations too, right? Like, how do we reconstruct? I'm interested in the resource distribution aspect of thinking about relationality. And part of relation is recognizing that, we're in relation to one another in what are oftentimes complex relations of power. Sometimes relations of power in which, like, how the power shakes out is actually, really kind of unclear. And recognizing and naming that and thinking about how that power affects, the materiality of that relation, is also something that we need to kind of be really deliberate about, not just letting be, but revising and reconstructing and revisiting. And so it's okay to think about doing this differently than it's always been done. It's but that has to happen through oftentimes a series of complicated conversations, and sometimes, as with the language that we end up using, the willingness to say, like, yeah, I used to do this way, or I used to use these terms, but I don't anymore for these reasons. And if I were to rewrite this, I might shift the way that I'm doing this, because I've had more time to think about it since I did that.
I very much agree with that. And I also think the degree to which that all the questions of remaking fields and undisciplining and so on do come down to a certain amount of privilege, that, someone asked me recently, did you have to be mid-career to write that book? And I think the answer to that is yes, because it takes, you have to take a big chance to say about your field or to your field, I'm going to try and remake this or undiscipline it or temporalize it differently and so on. And, that is not something that grad students, precariously employed colleagues can actually take the risk on a lot of the time. So partly it's a role for those of us who are securely employed and have other kinds of privilege behind us. At the same time, back to my kind of humility point, what can end up happening is that you end up getting a lot of credit for the work you do to do those things without also acknowledging that the privilege that allowed you to do it in the first place. So I think, I love Bridget's point about being willing to kind of admit to, the wrong language, the wrong approach, changing your mind, wanting to do it differently later on, is all part of remaking a discipline. Doing that work in public where people can see you is actually part of changing disciplines.
I love both of these points. And it makes me think about how, like I started this as a dissertation in order to get a job, right? And like published it as a book in order to keep my job. And, all of those imperatives, like it does mean that I feel like, a certain amount of, I don't know, the like, people, especially this year, I finished writing it a while ago, but this is the pace of academic publishing. So, I wasn't even writing it this year at all. But when people will occasionally call a book about policing to be like timely or something like that, it's like, I wish it weren't, like, I don't want this, like, I wish, the kinds of police violence I was thinking about when I started this project had, I wish we'd been able to eliminate them by now, but, and I do think, like, there's a lot that I would really love to write differently if I could go back and do it differently. I would love to, I would love to not have to think about it, as a kind of, as a, among other things, as a kind of like professional marketing document. It's a weird thing to go into a kind of research because, I think all of us are drawn to the work that we do because we care about it and we think it has something really important to say to the world and to in our classrooms. But at the same time, we have to use this to market ourselves to try to get an increasingly scarce number of livable jobs. And I think that makes all these conversations about field redefinition so much more complicated and sticky.
I have a few more questions, but I'm also wanting to open up the floor. So I guess if this is a call for anyone who has questions to start thinking about them and knowing that I can return to others. But Dara, if you want to go ahead and ask your question, that would be awesome.
Oh, thanks. I love these talks so much, and I'm loving the way they're pinging off of one another and ricocheting and coalescing and so on. So just a million thanks, really. I was interested actually in the talks, and it was this question was already formulating then, and then I feel like we've come back to it actually. So I'm so interested in the temporalities within which you're all working, right? So Sal, you were talking about the anticipatory nature of vagrancy law and the sort of proleptic nature of the imagining a potential future. And Bridget, I feel like that logic was operating as well in what you were talking about with the kind of the body, family, nation paradigm, and it's sort of recursive and yet future oriented. It's future orientation writ large, and that kind of disruption to some of the logic of reproductive futurism. But I was so interested in that. And then Nikki with the notion of the sort of belatedness, right? And that's both sort of temporally backward looking and yet also sort of future looking with a sort of humble stance or notion of possibility. And so I was there, and then in this most recent round of responses to questions, these questions about changing language, which is both backward-looking and forward-looking, the questions of remaking a discipline, which are again temporally sort of both at once, and then Bridget, when you were just talking, I was thinking right at the beginning of your response about Kilawazana Tompkins' piece in Avidly. It's a teaching piece, but she's talking about the speculative language of theory, like the speculative language of fiction. And so I guess I want to ask you all to comment on speculation and possibility and its role in the projects in which you're engaged.
I could start here. Yeah, I think in many ways, I'm thinking about, this is, vagrancy law is very crucially about speculation and anticipation. That's how it works legally. So for instance, if you're a justice of the peace in 18th century Britain, conducting a settlement examination. So you're trying to elicit a life story to find out if somebody, number one, where their parish of legal settlement is, but also if this person might be likely to rely on local poor relief in the future. And if you deem the person potentially likely to rely on poor relief, you get to treat them as if they will be reliant on poor relief in the future. You get to expel them to their parish of legal settlement, for instance, and saying this person is not our responsibility, it's somebody else's responsibility. And I think in many ways, maybe mine's maybe the most pessimistic about speculation and possibility, because it's very much about the way that speculation and possibility are deployed in the service of constructing policing and the scope and legitimacy of policing. And again, that's the ongoing sort of legal definition of for instance, the a police officer's legal, when they are deemed legally allowed to use force, deploy violence. It's if they think that somebody might pose a threat, right? It's about their anticipation or their anticipation of a future threat. And so I don't think this is the only way that speculation and possibility could be deployed. It's not like it's universally in the service of state violence, but that's the really particular imaginative and legal thread that I ended up tracing. So and indeed I'm thinking also of like how some of the ways that the policing of gender is like really generated by the kinds of deployment, like some of the queerest texts in the 18th century. I'm thinking like Henry Fielding's A Female Husband. That is a text that like so profoundly enables policing and so profoundly enables the surveillance of both gender and sexuality. And these two things are actually really linked. So I guess, yeah, mine is maybe the more pessimistic look at speculation and possibility, but of course there are other ways that can work.
Yeah, I sort of want to answer your question two different ways, Dara. One is that the point in the translations book is about what I didn't really have this language at the time before the pandemic, but now I would say sort of asynchronous, that romanticism happens asynchronously, that it's happening simultaneously in the colonies and Britain, yes, but it's also the same poems are being rewritten at different timescales in ways that make us need to reread the original differently, even though the original can't have been influenced by the translation. It sort of is influenced by the translation. So I do think that totally reimagining timescales away from our narrow periods, our narrow literary fields, our Eurocentric imaginations of what time is and how it operates. That's one answer. In my new book, which is somewhat connected to Sal's work in a funny sort of way. So the new book is about Indigenous quotation of British Romantic poetry as a kind of diplomatic force and the creation of diplomatic relationships via the use of Romantic poetry. And that is, I guess, maybe slightly more pessimistic in the sense that it traces moments where Romantic literature seemed full of possibility for imagining futures based on collaborative living on the land, living as partners on the land, living in harmony, and how quickly the promise of romanticism fails actually under the pressure of settler colonialism, that what the poetry seems to encode as key settler European values actually disintegrates under pressure. And so that's to answer, I guess, more your point about possibility, that Romantic poetry is full of this possibility of a just future that its own descendants do not live up to. Sorry to be a downer. Like Sal, that's where my work has led me.
These are really, really interesting points. I'm very interested in this form of in the anticipatory that Sal's talking about, that is a kind of pessimistic suspicion, and the resonance that you're talking about, Nikki, is as a possibility that is foreclosed in ways in which I've been interested in talking about the non-necessity of the future trajectories of white supremacy that I'm ending with in this project. And so like, I read Toni Morrison's A Mercy. Historical fiction is a great space for the speculative that is also retrospective. And I'm very, very interested in speculation and creative speculation, the kind of work that historical fiction does, I think, to think about both past and futures. But in A Mercy, we have this really interesting moment of failed potential for white women's solidarity with a variety of non-white women and girls. But one of the things that I think is really interesting, as Morrison still shows us the trajectory that makes the main white woman character, Rebecca, into a white woman, basically, over the course of this book. She becomes like the kind of white woman that's terribly recognizable. is the non-necessity of that that trajectory. Yes, we understand how this shakes out. Yes, we understand how her relationship to white men, means that she is going to align herself in such a way that she's going to have to remarry, and that this is not going to be, this kind of women's commune that she's working in with these people, and that these other folks are going to be maybe sold, but that it could have been, right. I'm up from the 80s, and so I'm thinking of that old song that talks about like the possibility that is lost, right? And the absolute non-necessity of white supremacist trajectories, because the kinds of things that you're talking about, suspicion, and I think the kinds of foreclosed possibilities that you're talking about, Nikki, are choices that people make. And those choices are choices that could have been otherwise. And so in many ways, I think because this particular project, and the animal project in many ways is this project is about, in many ways, white, white feminism that kind of ends with, the overarching alternative to what I'm describing, the failure of white feminism to create solidarity and sisterhood. And in the animal project, these, scientific trajectories, in which I'm, necessarily talking about racist texts, and in things that could have been otherwise, but appear in different ways, to produce human-animal relationships that are not doing the usual racist thing. That in the new project on early Black futures, I've been much more interested in framing temporality in terms of hope, and towards hope as a fairly radical apparatus, not necessarily realist, fairly speculative, but that's something that does actual, a theoretical and methodological work for the writers and thinkers who are employing radical hope for Black futures in the face of everything that they're encountering from about the 1870s-ish forward, and thinking about what it means to do that kind of speculation. What does it mean to step outside the realist, to think of the eschatological, for example, as a space for hope, or to think of the improbable, even as a space for not just imagining but enacting Black futures. Because I'm thinking of this in terms of the ways that we talk about Black children as neglected and forgotten in mainstream ways, and that has never been true. There have always been people who cared for Black children, who prioritized Black children, who made those futures happen, and ensured that future in face of all of these things. And so I've been choosing to kind of dwell in this little sliver of hopeful temporality in some way, as a way of not sidestepping, I think, all of these other realist things that are also operating absolutely simultaneously to this, but to, again, point to the non-necessity of those usual, even the dominant trajectory is not an inevitable one. It could have always been otherwise. And this is about actions, and the way that we talk about it, I think, is when we talk about history, is often in this kind of fatalist way, because it's predictable, because we know how this is going to shake out, because we're not surprised when these things keep happening, that this stuff keeps really relevant, in these later moments. But even while we're not surprised, even while we understand the historical trajectory, I think we also have to really understand, in order to enact any kind of radical change in the work we're doing, in our professions, in the world in general, we have to remember that it could be otherwise, or else what are we even doing? We're stuck in a tragedy or something. And that's like kind of not the generic form that I want to view all of this in, but I want to think about, other possible and perhaps speculative genres, for rethinking all of this work. And that's maybe just a mode of like self-care and the things, what do we have to do to make this work sustainable when we're, oftentimes writing about things that are terrible, is to, kind of recognize that, there are in any number of these moments, joy and speculation and hopefulness and things beyond even the most horrible things that are nevertheless happening.
Thank you. I have follow-up questions, but I also want to respect all of your time and to also open up to the audience if anyone has any lingering questions. I know there's been so much rich conversation, so I'm assuming a lot of it will continue to percolate for all of us. All right, so I guess my question kind of is in relation to Dara's a bit. I know all of you now have sort of discussed in different ways our responsibility to history and sort of our continued ongoing relationship. And I guess I'm curious also to hear you all think a little bit about space, because I think like the spatio-temporal aspect of all of your books is so interesting. I know, Bridget, you bring up Catherine McKittrick on spatial matters, and Sal, I think there definitely are moments where space becomes so important in, I guess, conversations of like enclosure and vagrancy, or even, I guess, bringing in more of a spatio-temporal aspect of like the idea of temporal drag, Freeman's term that you bring up at the end. And then Nikki, maybe this is also an opportunity, I guess, to think a little bit about, I think about like migration, the flow between people, and also just trans-Indigenous discourse, period. So a large, multifaceted question, but.
All right, I'll have a go very quickly. Yeah, I mean, a part of the rationale for the book was to think outside a transatlantic world, not because transatlanticism isn't important, but because I think part of the fixation on the transatlantic is actually a reflection of modern Anglo-American supremacy in the academy, and coming from outside that world, wanting to reimagine that space and reimagine the world centered around the Pacific rather than the Atlantic. Is sort of part of the rationale for the book. I actually wanted to answer this in a slightly different way, though, because I was thinking about Sal's comments about how we teach and how we teach in a way that is not policing or surveilling without conflating all kinds of discipline and order to policing. I've spoken about this recently, and there's a video floating around on the Keats-Shelley Association website about teaching in other spaces and how the physical environment of our classrooms, how changing that is changing the way we think about what kinds of discipline might actually be quite productive for this work and productive for our students as well. So I'll stop there. People can look at that video if they want to.
I know that was also a lot of different questions. So really, if there's just anything that anyone would like to say to sort of close this out as well, that would be great.
In many ways, for me, space becomes a matter of scale. And so as I'm thinking about theories of racialization, racial formation, and this question of where race resides, whether it's in individual bodies, whether it's in racialized families, whether it's just in racialized nations, right? Whether geographical spaces like Saint-Domingue racialize, when we have words that are ambiguous and racializing, that are related to space in a certain way, right? When like John Adams calls Alexander Hamilton Creole bastard, right? Like that, that's a racializing ambiguous term, but it's also about where he's from and what colonized spaces do. When we don't know that Jean-Jacques Audubon was born in Saint-Domingue, and how that changes, the very Americanized John James guy who becomes the bird guy, it kind of shows us pretty clearly how spaces, geographic spaces, do that racializing work. and what our conversation about this, this would be if it was kind of more commonly known beyond like academic work on him, that these are these connections to the pre-Haitian Revolution space. I think we might think a little bit differently too about these smaller scale spaces in which race resides. Like, what does it mean to think that race is a bodily thing when bodies are like kind of ambiguous sometimes? When a pregnant mother when Meghan Markle contains a baby who may be racialized in a certain way, and people don't know how the baby's going to look, and then they have feelings about how Black that baby's going to be while it's still inside her body. That's a spatialized scale for racialization, that still matters for us. And that these, these spaces aren't extricable. I think this is kind of what I'm taking from the McKittrick, is that racialization can't be, divorced from questions of place and land and sovereignty and colonialization, because bodies live in those spaces and move around those spaces to other spaces. In that movement in space, big space, little space, keeping the domestic out of the home or whatever, keeping the racialized other out of the domestic space of the home, all of those movements could shift things in this totally constructed, precarious, racializing world, in which we can see how racial anxieties are built upon people saying that this is totally fixed in nature and absolute, but not really believing that that's true, given how they're acting, about racialized others as somehow threats to their own racialization.
I love all these thoughts on scale and just sort of and of course, like the non-necessity of to go back to your earlier statement, Bridget, about the non-necessity of these historical developments, which is just so important. And I think like something that we can all think about, like in our teaching too, right? That is the opportunity we have as people who teach these historical texts to really, I'm thinking about all of the ways that every time I teach, Afro-Benz Orinoco, for instance, there's always the debate actually between students now, and increasingly students will shut this down before I even have to, which is great, where there's the original like, oh, she's a product of her times, rather than like, well, that's not, what are her times? Her times aren't doing anything. She is doing something as an author. She's making choices. Like, let's talk about her. So yeah, I think I want to think about so one of the ways, sort of in that spirit, one of the ways that I think about the kind of the active construction, sort of choice by choice, on a really small routine scale of, what would later come to be a kind of seemingly unquestionable legitimacy for policing. Like a lot of that happened through space more than it did through exclusively the criminalization of specific people. And what do I mean by that? It's that we often think of criminal law as being foundationally invested in individual criminal responsibility. Can you prove criminal intent, that this person intended to commit this act? But the important thing about vagrancy law is that it didn't work that way. Criminal intent was not necessary. Nor was a trial. And so determining an individual's criminal responsibility was just not the point. It was about sorting populations and about assigning sort of future threat rather than adjudicating an individual's criminal responsibility or intent. And in many ways, it was very much about defining, what I end up calling geographies of responsibility, right? Whose subsistence is this place responsible for? And whose subsistence is this place not responsible for? One of the ways that this happens as a kind of, it ends up, I'm thinking of the many trajectories of race and nation that this follows. I mean, one really, really clear example would be the Sierra Leone colonization project in the 1780s that starts out as a relief project for a sort of poor relief scheme for Asian sailors stranded in Britain, and then expands to also include Afro-British, often mostly loyalists from Nova Scotia, and ends up being kind of promoted by, you know, the white men who were in charge of this project as a kind of essentially a repatriation to Africa poor relief project, even though of course most of the people who who ended up settling in Sierra Leone were not from Africa at all. And so the repatriation was very much a misnomer. But what that ended up doing was using the very old logic of local parish poor relief, right? A parish is responsible for its own poor and not for anyone else's, using that as a model for thinking about the nation more generally. Well, who is the nation responsible for, and who is outside the nation's responsibility? And that's how, you know, Britishness becomes intensely racialized in this. You know, we can see like that's a really specific, clear flashpoint for that happening. And of course, you know, again, the way immigration is discussed in, you know, both in Britain today and in the US is, you know, obviously like a clear inheritor of this. So I guess, you know, that's one of the ways I think about space. But then the other is that, you know, the kind of, this is also the fact that vagrancy laws are both really sort of repurposed in very different ways in different parts of the British Empire. That's also key, right? Part of how the 18th century British Empire works, both legally and culturally, is through a sort of regime of legal pluralism and not through a regime of kind of uniformity. Different laws are deployed differently in different places, and that differentiation is actually really crucial to how the entire empire works. And so I think, you know, this is again like the fact that it goes back to, I think a lot of our students, or at least this is I can't speak for other people's students, my students, they often expect empire to look Victorian. They expect a certain 19th century vision of what empire is. And I think one of the things that I think about a lot in teaching the 18th century material is that, you know, empire, like a lot of, you know, things like, I don't know, issues of the Spectator that seem to be a celebration of diversity in saying like, oh, look at all the people and goods from all over the world that are just gathering under the virtuous capitalism, you know, centering in London. That's just as imperialist as a claim to, you know, a civilizing mission. It's just a really different version of it. And so I think that the sorts of differentiation that occur in different parts of the empire, it's also, I don't know, that became really clear as a mechanism of empire in the 18th century specifically. So I guess those are a few thoughts about space and time. I guess, yeah.
No, that's amazing. And I know I feel like it is appropriate that we talked about relationality first, because all of these are pretty hard to like extricate from each other. Unless there are any other questions, I just wanted to go ahead and thank everyone for coming and express a lot of gratitude to Sal, Bridget, and Nikki for coming. This was a very exciting Zoom event for us to have in a semester that I think a lot of people are really feeling Zoom burnout in general. So this was a very energizing Zoom call, which is really great. So thank you all so much.
Thank you so much. This was great to put these things in conversation.
Thanks for organizing and getting us all together. I really appreciate it.